Science tried
The
to
year
explain her,
was
but failed. This is her
1897,
true story from
a time when
1897.
science believed it was finally beginning to understand the world.
That's impossible. You
Laboratories were
couldn't
filled
have.
with confidence.
She's lying.
Books were written
Your
with
work is a
certainty,
disgrace.
and men in suits
None-
believed that every mystery could eventually be measured, tested, and explained. Intelligence had rules, ability
As X
had
approaches
limits,
infinity, the function
and society
converges.
had already
At the interval of the
decided who
second
was
term,
allowed
it
to be
resolves to a
called
finite
brilliant
constant.
Incredible.
and who
She's
was
solving
not.
it. This is beyond
That was
advanced.
the world
solution
she was
is
born
here.
into.
A genius in
A
our
world
midst.
that thought it already knew the answers before it ever asked the questions. At first, nothing about her seemed extraordinary to outsiders. She came from simplicity, from quiet routines and ordinary expectations. No one imagined that history would ever remember her name or even her story. But sometimes, the most powerful disruptions do not arrive loudly. They begin in silence, in small moments, in answers given too quickly, in observations that feel too deep for someone so young. People noticed, but they dismissed it. Luck, they said. Coincidence. Children repeat things they hear. Children guess correctly sometimes. But she did not guess. She understood, and that was where the discomfort began. Teachers found themselves pausing longer than usual after asking her questions. Adults exchanged glances when she spoke. There was something unsettling about intelligence that did not follow expectations, especially in a time when society itself was built on assumptions. The more she answered, the more questions surrounded her, not about what she knew, but about how she could possibly know it. Curiosity slowly replaced doubt. Then curiosity turned into investigation. Men of science arrived with notebooks and careful expressions. They believed they were approaching a puzzle, something that could be broken down into parts and studied logically. Memory tests, reasoning tests, observations of behavior. Each attempt carried the same quiet confidence that eventually the mystery would collapse into explanation. But it never did. She answered questions in ways they did not predict. She solved problems without showing the steps they expected to see. When pushed, she did not perform like someone trying to impress. She simply responded naturally, as if the answers existed somewhere obvious that others could not see. And that unsettled them more than failure ever could, because science is comfortable with being wrong. What it struggles with is being unable to explain why. The room would often fall silent after her responses. Pens stopped moving. Conversations shifted from certainty to uncertainty. Some called her gifted, others called it unusual. A few quietly wondered if something else was happening, something they did not yet have language for. In that era, intelligence was supposed to follow patterns, background defined potential, expectations defined outcomes. She did not follow those rules, and slowly admiration began to mix with discomfort. The attention placed weight on her shoulders she never asked for. Adults debated her abilities, while she simply lived inside them. Every answer she gave became evidence. Every mistake became scrutiny. She was no longer just a child learning about the world. She had become something to be explained by it. And in that transformation, something deeply human was often forgotten. She felt the distance growing. People watched her differently. Some with fascination, others with suspicion. The same intelligence that impressed people also separated her from them. Conversations around her lowered in volume. Decisions were made about her without her understanding why. The more science tried to define her, the less they seemed to understand who she actually was. And that may have been the greatest failure of all, because what they were trying to measure was not just intelligence. It was potential shaped by experience, perception shaped by survival, and a mind that saw connections others overlooked. But numbers and tests could not fully capture that. Science searched for a formula, while her story remained deeply human, emotional, and complex. Eventually the excitement faded, not because answers were found but because none were. Records became incomplete. Interest moved elsewhere. The world, as it often does, continued forward. New discoveries replaced old mysteries, and slowly, her story began to disappear into the quiet corners of history. But failure does not always mean defeat. Sometimes failure reveals limits. The scientists of 1897 were not wrong for asking questions. They were wrong in believing that every human story could be reduced to explanation. Her existence challenged something deeper than knowledge. It challenged certainty itself. It reminded people that intelligence is not owned by institutions, nor confined by expectations created by society. And perhaps that is why her story still echoes today. Because even now, in a world filled with technology and advanced understanding, there are moments when humanity still encounters something it cannot easily explain. Moments that force us to pause and admit that understanding is always incomplete. That brilliance can appear where the world least expects it. That history is filled with voices that were never fully heard because they did not fit the narrative of their time. She was one of those voices, not a mystery to be solved, but a reminder to be remembered. In the end, science did not fail because it lacked intelligence. It failed because it searched only for answers, while her story asked for something else: humility. The recognition that human potential cannot always be predicted, categorized, or controlled. That sometimes the most extraordinary stories are not about proving something, but about challenging what we believe to be possible. And somewhere in the silence left behind by unfinished records and unanswered questions, her story remains, not as proof of something supernatural, nor as a legend exaggerated by time, but as a quiet truth from 1897, that understanding has limits, and that beyond those limits, there are still stories waiting to be seen, waiting to be heard, and waiting to remind us that the human mind is far more complex than any era is ready to admit. At first, people believed the story would fade on its own. Extraordinary moments often do. A surprising child, a clever answer, a brief moment of attention, and then life returns to normal. That is what everyone expected. But normal never truly returned after she began to be noticed. Because once people start watching closely, they begin seeing things they missed before. And in her case, the more they looked, the more difficult it became to explain what they were seeing. She did not behave like someone trying to prove anything. There was no performance in her words, no desire to impress the adults who surrounded her with questions. She listened quietly, answered simply, and returned to silence as if nothing unusual had happened. That calmness unsettled people more than confidence ever could. Genius, in their minds, was supposed to be loud, ambitious, and obvious. But she carried her intelligence like something natural, something that did not need to be announced. Those around her began remembering earlier moments differently. Small incidents that once seemed ordinary suddenly felt important. A conversation she understood too quickly. A problem she solved without guidance. Questions she asked that sounded less like curiosity and more like insight. It was as if her story had been unfolding quietly, long before anyone realized they were witnessing it. Yet, admiration was never simple in that time. Society had already decided what intelligence should look like, where it should come from, and who was expected to possess it. She did not fit those expectations. And when reality challenges belief, people often struggle to accept what stands in front of them. Some praised her quietly, impressed, but cautious. Others searched for reasons to doubt. Luck, repetition, coincidence, explanations that felt safer than admitting they did not understand. The attention slowly changed the atmosphere around her. Conversations paused when she entered rooms. Adults lowered their voices, thinking she would not notice. But she noticed everything: the curiosity, the hesitation, the uncertainty. She began to understand that she was being observed differently, not as a child growing and learning, but as something unusual that needed explanation. And that realization carried a weight she could not yet name. Scientists and educated observers approached with careful politeness. Their questions were structured, deliberate, designed to measure rather than to know. They believed answers could be organized, patterns identified, conclusions drawn. Each test carried an expectation that eventually her abilities would reveal a clear reason, but every attempt seemed to lead back to the same quiet confusion. She solved problems in ways that felt intuitive rather than learned. When asked how she reached conclusions, she often struggled to explain, not because she was hiding anything, but because the process felt natural to her. To those studying her, this absence of visible reasoning became its own mystery. They wanted steps, she offered results. And in that gap between expectation and reality, uncertainty grew. Outside those rooms, life continued with its ordinary struggles. She was still young, still human, still navigating emotions that had nothing to do with intelligence. Yet the attention made normal moments feel different. Friendship became complicated. Playfulness faded under watchful eyes. Praise sometimes felt heavier than criticism, because it reminded her that she was being measured constantly, even when she wished to be invisible. The adults around her rarely noticed that change. They were focused on understanding her mind, not realizing that the process itself was shaping her experience. Questions replaced conversations. Observations replaced connection. And slowly, the distance between her and others widened, not because she wanted it, but because expectation created it. What unsettled many observers most was not how much she knew, but how calmly she carried it. There was no arrogance, no urgency to prove herself right. She answered, then returned to silence. That quiet confidence challenged the assumptions of the time. Intelligence, they believed, should come with ambition, with visible effort, but she seemed untouched by the need for recognition. And that made her difficult to categorize. As weeks turned into months, the excitement began to shift. Curiosity remained, but certainty disappeared. Some scientists admitted privately that their tools were limited. Others insisted more testing was needed. No one wanted to say openly that they might be facing something beyond their understanding. In an era defined by progress and discovery, uncertainty felt like failure. Yet the true story was never about proving science wrong. It was about revealing how incomplete understanding can be when it ignores the human element. She was not an experiment. She was a person living through a tension she never asked for, carrying expectations she never created. And while others debated theories, she simply continued being herself, learning, observing, growing in ways that could not be easily recorded. Over time, the intensity of attention began to fade. New interests emerged, new discoveries demanded focus, and the world moved forward as it always does. But something had already changed. Those who witnessed her abilities carried a quiet memory of uncertainty, a moment when certainty slipped through their fingers. They had encountered something that refused to fit neatly into explanation, and perhaps that was the most important part of her story, because not every remarkable life ends with recognition or clear conclusions. Some stories remain unfinished, not because they lack meaning, but because they challenge the limits of the systems trying to define them. Her story became one of those quiet echoes, remembered by a few, questioned by many, and slowly absorbed into history without resolution. In the silence that followed, one truth remained undeniable. Intelligence does not always appear where society expects it, and when it does, the reaction often reveals more about the observers than about the person being observed. The need to explain, to categorize, to control, these impulses can sometimes blind people to the simple reality in front of them. She was never trying to change history. She was simply living within it. And yet, without intention, she forced those around her to confront something uncomfortable, the possibility that understanding has limits, and that human potential cannot always be predicted by the beliefs of a single era. Her story did not end with answers. It ended with questions that lingered long after the attention disappeared. Questions about knowledge, about expectation, about how many stories like hers were overlooked because they did not fit what the world was ready to accept. And somewhere between admiration and confusion, her presence left behind something quieter than fame but far more lasting. A reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary stories are not the ones fully explained, but the ones that make us realize how much we still do not understand. The moment itself did not arrive with warning. There was no announcement, no dramatic beginning, no sense that history was about to shift in a quiet room filled with ordinary expectations. It began like any other day, with simple questions asked out of routine, the kind that adults never imagine will change the way they see someone forever. And yet, sometimes a single moment is enough to divide time into before and after. She sat calmly, listening more than speaking, as she often did. Those around her expected another ordinary exchange, another small demonstration of intelligence that could be explained later. But this time was different. The question placed before her was not simple, not something easily memorized or repeated. It required reasoning, connection, and understanding beyond what anyone expected from someone her age. The adults exchanged confident looks, certain that difficulty would finally slow her down. Instead, she answered almost immediately. Not with hesitation, not with guessing, but with clarity. Her response was precise, thoughtful, and unsettlingly complete. The room grew quiet in a way that felt heavy rather than impressed. One person laughed softly at first, assuming coincidence. Another asked her to explain how she reached the answer. She paused, searching for words, as if trying to describe something that felt obvious to her but invisible to everyone else. And that was when the unease began. Because her explanation did not follow the expected path. She described connections others had not considered, steps that seemed too advanced, observations that suggested a way of thinking far beyond simple learning. It was not just that she was correct, it was that she arrived at the conclusion differently, and in that difference, certainty began to crack. The adults asked more questions, their voices now carrying curiosity mixed with disbelief. Each new problem was meant to reveal limits, to restore balance to what felt suddenly uncertain. But the limits did not appear. She answered again and again, calmly, naturally, without the tension of someone trying to succeed. To her, it seemed normal. To them, it felt impossible. Word spread quickly after that day. Stories have a way of growing as they travel, especially when they challenge expectations. Some accounts exaggerated what happened, others questioned it entirely. But those who had been present agreed on one thing. Something unusual had taken place, something that could not easily be dismissed. For her, however, life did not suddenly feel extraordinary. She did not experience the moment as a turning point. She only noticed the change afterward, in the way people looked at her, in the pauses before they spoke, in the careful tone adults began to use. Attention replaced familiarity, curiosity replaced comfort, and slowly she realized that people were no longer seeing her as they once had. The attention brought pressure she could not fully understand. Every conversation felt like a test. Every answer carried expectation. The same intelligence that once passed unnoticed now defined her entirely. People stopped asking who she was and began asking what she was capable of. The difference was subtle, but deeply important. Scientists and observers soon followed, drawn by reports that sounded almost unbelievable. They approached with professionalism, notebooks ready, convinced that careful observation would reveal the truth behind the story. They believed the moment could be explained once enough data was collected. After all, science had solved many mysteries before. But this moment refused to settle into explanation. Repeated tests only deepened the confusion. She continued to respond in ways that felt intuitive rather than rehearsed. When challenged with unfamiliar problems, she adapted quickly, often reaching conclusions that surprised even those asking the questions. The more they examined her thinking, the more difficult it became to reduce it to a simple explanation. Some observers felt excitement, others felt discomfort, because the implications stretched beyond one child. If intelligence could appear in ways that defied expectation, then perhaps the assumptions guiding society were incomplete. And that was a far more unsettling possibility than any single mystery. Amid all this, her own experience remained quietly human. She still felt uncertainty, still experienced moments of doubt, still longed for ordinary interactions untouched by scrutiny. But the moment that shocked everyone else had already changed her path. She could not return to being unnoticed. The world had decided she was different, and once that decision was made, it shaped everything that followed. The day itself became a story told repeatedly, each retelling adding layers of meaning. Some described it as proof of genius. Others treated it as an anomaly waiting to be corrected. Yet no version fully captured what truly happened. A simple moment where expectation collided with reality, and reality refused to conform. As time passed, the shock softened into fascination. The initial disbelief faded, replaced by ongoing attempts to understand. But the memory of that first moment remained powerful for those who witnessed it. It was the instant when certainty faltered, when knowledge felt suddenly incomplete, when people realized that understanding is sometimes smaller than the human mind standing in front of them. And perhaps that is why the moment mattered so much. Not because it proved something extraordinary beyond doubt, but because it forced people to confront their own assumptions. It revealed how easily expectations can limit perception, how often brilliance goes unnoticed until it becomes impossible to ignore. The shock was not only about her ability, it was about the realization that the world was more complex than they believed. For her, the moment passed quietly, absorbed into the flow of days that followed. But its consequences remained. It marked the beginning of deeper questions, stronger attention, and growing distance between who she was and how others saw her. A single answer had changed everything, not through intention, but through impact. And in the years that followed, that moment would be remembered not as the day she proved something to science, but as the day science realized it might not yet have all the answers. A reminder that discovery does not always come from laboratories or theories, but sometimes from unexpected voices that challenge certainty simply by existing. The shock eventually faded, as all shocks do. Life continued, new stories emerged, and the world moved forward. Yet beneath that movement remained a quiet understanding among those who had witnessed it, that they had seen something rare, something that could not be easily explained or forgotten. A moment when the ordinary revealed something extraordinary, and in doing so, changed the way people understood possibility itself. By the time curiosity turned into serious attention, the atmosphere around her had already changed. What once felt like quiet interest slowly became something more deliberate, more organized. People no longer spoke about her in passing. Her name began appearing in conversations among those who believed they understood the human mind. And with that attention came a new kind of presence, not admiration alone, but investigation. The men who arrived carried confidence shaped by education and experience. They believed in observation, in measurement, in the idea that every unusual ability could eventually be explained through careful study. To them, she was not a mystery in the emotional sense. She was a question waiting for an answer. And questions, in their world, always led somewhere logical. At first, their approach seemed gentle. They asked simple questions, watched her reactions, noted her responses. Their tone remained polite, almost reassuring, as if trying to make the process feel natural. But beneath that politeness existed expectation. They were not there merely to listen. They were there to understand, to define, to reach conclusions that would restore certainty. She did not resist their presence. She answered as she always had, calmly, without performance, without awareness that each word was being recorded and analyzed. To her, these were conversations. To them, they were data. And in that difference, something subtle began to shift. The tests became more structured over time. Patterns were introduced, problems designed to challenge reasoning, memory, and perception. Some questions were intentionally misleading, created to observe how she corrected errors. Others were complex, meant to push beyond ordinary limits. The expectation remained the same. Eventually the pattern would reveal itself, but the pattern refused to appear. She approached problems differently each time, adapting in ways that surprised those observing her. When faced with unfamiliar ideas, she did not hesitate long. Instead, she seemed to explore possibilities instinctively, arriving at answers through connections that felt invisible to others. The scientists found themselves writing more notes, asking more follow-up questions, searching for consistency that would make her understandable within their frameworks. Yet consistency, in the way they expected, never came. Some began to admire her openly. Others grew increasingly frustrated. Science depends on repetition, on predictable outcomes that can be explained and repeated by others. But her thinking did not behave predictably. It was fluid, intuitive, shaped by something they struggled to measure. The more they observed, the less certain they became. Conversations among the observers began to change. Early confidence gave way to quieter debates. Was she exceptional, or were their methods incomplete? Were they witnessing unusual intelligence, or confronting limits within their own understanding? These questions were rarely spoken in front of her, but they filled the spaces between official discussions. Meanwhile, she experienced the process differently. The attention felt heavier now. Questions came more frequently, often without warmth. She sensed that answers were no longer enough. People wanted explanations she could not give. When asked how she knew something, she struggled to respond, not because she wished to hide her thinking, because it felt natural, almost automatic. Explaining it felt like trying to describe breathing. This inability to explain unsettled the observers most of all. They were accustomed to knowledge being visible, steps written clearly, reasoning expressed logically. Her answers appeared complete without revealing the path that led to them. And in science, hidden processes create discomfort. Understanding requires visibility. Mystery resists control. Outside those sessions, life continued quietly, but the difference remained. She was no longer simply living her life. She was being watched within it. Ordinary mistakes carried greater weight. Moments of silence were interpreted as meaning something more. The simple act of being herself became complicated by expectation. The scientists, however, pressed forward. They believed persistence would eventually succeed. History had shown that many mysteries required patience before yielding answers. But what they did not realize was that their search itself was changing the story. The more they focused on explaining her, the less they seemed to understand her as a person. There were moments when the room felt tense, when answers created more questions than satisfaction. Some observers began to sense that they were approaching the limits of their methods. Not failure in the traditional sense, but limitation. The realization that not everything meaningful could be measured precisely. And that realization was uncomfortable, because science, especially in that era, was built on certainty. Progress meant replacing mystery with knowledge. Yet here stood a case where knowledge seemed to increase uncertainty rather than reduce it. Each discovery opened new questions instead of closing old ones. The more they learned, the less complete their understanding felt. For her, the experience became isolating in ways few noticed. She was surrounded by attention but lacked connection. People listened closely to her answers but rarely to her feelings. Her intelligence became the center of every interaction, leaving little room for the ordinary experiences of childhood. And though no one intended harm, the distance grew nonetheless. Over time, the tone of the investigations softened, not because answers had been found, but because certainty had faded. Some observers quietly accepted that explanation might not come easily. Others moved on to subjects more cooperative with measurement. Interest, once intense, began to disperse. Yet something lasting remained. The attempt to explain her had revealed as much about science as it had about her. It showed how strongly people rely on frameworks to make sense of the world, and how unsettling it becomes when those frameworks fail to hold. Her story exposed a gap between observation and understanding, between intelligence and interpretation. And perhaps that was the true turning point, because the question slowly changed from "what is she?" to something far more difficult: what are we missing? That question lingered long after the formal investigations ended. It remained in quiet conversations, in unfinished notes, in the uneasy recognition that knowledge has boundaries. She never asked to challenge science. She simply existed in a way that revealed its limits, and in doing so, she became part of a larger story, not about proving something extraordinary, but about reminding people that human potential cannot always be reduced to explanation. As the attention faded and life moved forward, the investigations became memories. But the uncertainty they created did not disappear. It remained as a quiet reminder that understanding is always evolving, always incomplete, and that sometimes the most important discoveries are not answers, but the realization that some questions cannot yet be answered at all. By the time the testing became more intense, the atmosphere had changed in ways few people openly acknowledged. What had once felt like curiosity now carried pressure. The questions were no longer casual, and the observers no longer hid their expectations. They wanted clarity, they wanted proof. Most of all, they wanted resolution, something that would allow them to say they understood what they were witnessing. The rooms where these tests took place were often quiet, filled with the soft sounds of paper turning and pens moving across notebooks. Everything felt deliberate. Each question was carefully chosen, each response carefully noted. The process was meant to remove uncertainty, to separate emotion from observation. Science believed that if enough information was gathered, the mystery would eventually disappear. But instead, the mystery deepened. She approached task without visible strain. Problems that were meant to challenge her often seemed to interest her more than intimidate her. When faced with unfamiliar situations, she did not panic or guess blindly. She paused, observed, and then responded with a calm certainty that unsettled those watching. It was not perfection that confused them. It was consistency without visible effort. Again and again, the results refused to settle into expectation. Some tests were designed to reveal limits in memory. Others aimed to challenge reasoning under pressure. A few attempted to confuse or mislead, to observe how she corrected mistakes. Yet she adapted quickly, sometimes noticing patterns before they were fully explained. The observers began comparing notes, searching for errors in their own methods, wondering if they had overlooked something obvious, but nothing explained what they were seeing. The more structured the testing became, the more uncomfortable the atmosphere felt. Questions grew sharper. Repetition increased. There was an unspoken urgency behind every session, as though time itself demanded an answer. The scientists were not only studying her anymore, they were defending their understanding of how intelligence was supposed to work. And that was where tension quietly entered the room, because every unexpected result challenged more than theory. It challenged belief. Intelligence, as they understood it, followed certain paths shaped by education, environment, and opportunity. She did not follow those paths. Her thinking appeared intuitive, flexible, and deeply observant in ways that resisted measurement. And science, at least in that moment, struggled with what it could N-O-T measure. For her, the experience felt increasingly heavy. The questions never truly ended. Each answer seemed to lead to another test, another observation, another attempt to define her. She began to sense that success did not bring relief. Instead, it brought more attention, more scrutiny. The simple act of thinking became something others watched closely, analyzed and debated. There were moments when silence filled the room after she spoke. Not the silence of admiration, but the silence of uncertainty. Observers exchanged glances, unsure whether to be impressed or concerned. Some began to wonder privately whether they were asking the wrong questions altogether. Yet, stopping was not easy. Science moves forward through persistence. To admit uncertainty felt too close to failure, and failure was difficult to accept in an era built on progress. So the testing continued, even as confidence slowly faded. Reports became more cautious in their language. Conclusions were delayed. Explanations grew less certain. And still, she remained calm within it all. She did not argue with the process. She did not attempt to challenge those studying her. She simply answered as she always had, unaware that her natural responses were creating discomfort among people accustomed to control and predictability. In many ways, her quietness made the situation more powerful. There was no rebellion, no attempt to prove anything, only existence that refused to fit expectation. Outside the testing rooms, life felt increasingly distant. Ordinary conversations seemed smaller compared to the constant examination she experienced. The attention created separation, not through intention, but through difference. Others began to see her less as a person and more as a phenomenon, and that transformation carried a loneliness few recognized. Meanwhile, debates continued among those observing her. Some argued that her abilities represented exceptional intelligence that current methods simply could not yet explain. Others searched for hidden factors, convinced that an explanation must exist somewhere beneath the surface, but agreement remained out of reach. What unsettled them most was not that she succeeded in difficult tests. It was that the tests themselves seemed insufficient. The tools designed to measure intelligence felt suddenly limited, as though they were attempting to capture something larger than their design allowed, and that realization quietly shifted the focus of the story. The question was no longer only about her abilities. It became about the boundaries of understanding itself. In time, fatigue replaced urgency. The constant search for explanation began to lose momentum, not because answers had been found, but because none seemed close. Some observers moved on to other work, more comfortable subjects that produced clearer results. The intensity faded, leaving behind unfinished notes and unresolved conclusions. Yet the impact remained. The testing had revealed something unexpected, not a definitive answer, but a confrontation with limitation. Science had approached the situation with confidence, believing it could explain everything placed before it. Instead, it encountered complexity that resisted reduction, and in that encounter, certainty softened into humility. For her, the end of testing did not feel like victory. It felt like quiet release. The pressure eased, though the distance created by attention did not disappear entirely. She had lived through a period where her mind became the center of inquiry, where every response carried meaning beyond intention. And when it ended, what remained was not fame or recognition, but experience, an experience that revealed how easily human stories can be transformed when others attempt to define them. Looking back, the testing phase became one of the most significant chapters in her story, not because it solved anything, but because it exposed the limits of explanation. It showed how knowledge, despite its power, is always shaped by perspective. And sometimes the most honest conclusion is not certainty, but acknowledgement of what remains unknown. In the silence that followed, the mystery did not disappear. It simply changed form. No longer a problem to be solved, it became a reminder that intelligence cannot always be reduced to numbers, that understanding requires more than observation, and that some stories leave their greatest impact not through answers, but through the questions they refuse to resolve. By the time fear began to weave itself into the curiosity surrounding her, the world around her had already shifted in subtle but profound ways. What started as admiration, as quiet wonder at her abilities, now carried an undercurrent of unease. People were no longer simply impressed, they were uncertain. And uncertainty has a way of creating fear, even in those who believe themselves rational, even in those trained to measure and understand. The adults who had once watched her with polite curiosity now approached with caution. Conversations about her intelligence were filled with hesitation. Words were chosen carefully, tones measured, as if the wrong phrase might provoke some unseen consequence. Some observers questioned themselves in ways they had never imagined. Had they misjudged childhood, misunderstood learning, underestimated a young mind? And that doubt unsettled them more than any failure ever could. It was not overt fear, the kind that causes panic or visible anxiety. It was subtle. It was the pause in speech, the lingering glance, the sudden awareness that someone small, young, and previously underestimated, had revealed a gap in understanding that could not easily be filled. In 1897, society relied heavily on expectation. Intelligence, talent, and ability were assigned according to social class, gender, and circumstance. She defied those rules, and that defiance quietly threatened the order that had always been assumed. At times she sensed it herself. She did not fully understand the weight of the attention, but she noticed the quiet changes. The longer adults observed, the more careful they became. The questions grew sharper, their eyes lingered longer, their tone carried subtle tension. It was no longer enough to answer correctly. She was being studied, measured, and interpreted. She could feel the space between herself and others stretching wider with each inquiry. The scientists who had approached with curiosity and confidence began to recognize limits they had never imagined. Their theories about intelligence, about how the mind works, began to feel fragile. They had been trained to believe that careful observation, repeated testing, and rigorous methodology could reveal the truth about human potential. But she fared results that were intuitive, unpredictable, yet consistently remarkable. Their tools, their methods, their assumptions, none seemed adequate to contain her mind. And that inadequacy produced fear. Not fear of harm, but fear of the unknown. Fear of something that could not be neatly categorized or controlled. Fear that the very systems designed to measure brilliance might be insufficient. For the first time, some began to doubt themselves. And when the observers doubt themselves, the person being observed carries a silent, invisible weight. At the same time, fear spread quietly among the wider social circles who heard rumors of her abilities. Admiration was mixed with skepticism, and skepticism often masks insecurity. People whispered questions about how such intelligence could exist outside the frameworks they trusted. Some feared the implications. If one child could defy expectation, how many others had been overlooked? How many potential minds were hidden simply because society refused to acknowledge them? Meanwhile, she lived through this quietly. She did not see the fear as adults did. She only experienced attention, observation, and the subtle distance growing around her. Everyday interactions became strained. Simple conversations were filtered through expectation and measurement. Praise carried a strange weight, and curiosity often came with the pressure to perform. The joy of discovery, natural to childhood, was overshadowed by the intensity of observation. Even within the controlled environment of scientific inquiry, fear changed the dynamics. Observers grew cautious in their questioning. They sought to challenge her, but not too much. They tested boundary, but hesitated to push too far. There was an awareness, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes unspoken, that the mind they were studying was not fully comprehensible, and that pushing too aggressively might disturb the natural intelligence they had come to admire. The tension became a persistent companion. Science, so confident in its capacity to measure and define, was confronted with limitation. Human potential proved unpredictable. The methods designed to capture brilliance revealed only partial truths, leaving gaps that could not be explained. And in those gaps, fear quietly settled. For her, the weight of observation shaped her understanding of the world. She began to notice that people responded differently to her, depending on what they expected her to do. Success did not always bring relief. Correct answers often led to more questions, more scrutiny, more subtle distance. Even kindness carried a trace of caution. Every interaction became a delicate balance between being herself and meeting the unspoken demands placed upon her by the uncertainty she inspired. The fear surrounding her was not malicious, but it was real. It affected how adults spoke, how decisions were made, how attention was given. Admiration and fear coexisted uneasily, creating a tension that was difficult for anyone to navigate, most of all for a child experiencing it from within. And yet, it was in this environment that her quiet resilience shone. Despite the subtle pressures and the unspoken fears, she continued to respond naturally. She did not let expectation dictate thought, nor observation dictate behavior. Her intelligence remained authentic, unperformed, and profoundly human. The NCE of fear, ultimately, was not only on those observing her, but on the broader story. It shaped the way history would later perceive her abilities, influencing which details were recorded and which were quietly forgotten. Fear altered narratives, filtered perspectives, and added layers of mystery, an already complex tale. What emerged from this period was a realization that brilliance can provoke unease, not because it is dangerous, but because it disrupts established understanding. Her existence challenged assumptions, not intentionally, but by the very act of thinking differently. And in that challenge, she revealed an uncomfortable truth. Human potential is far more expansive than the frameworks we construct to measure it. The story of fear intertwined with curiosity reminds us that discovery is not always celebrated in its own time. Sometimes it produces awe, sometimes it produces unease, and sometimes it quietly shifts the very way people perceive possibility. Her story, observed under the shadow of fear, teaches a lesson still relevant today. True intelligence often unsettles, challenges, and defies expectation. And it is precisely in that defiance, in the space where curiosity meets fear, that humanity encounters the most profound opportunities for understanding, not just of the extraordinary mind before it, but of the limits, biases, and assumptions within itself. What they could not explain became the quiet obsession of those who observed her. It was not failure in the traditional sense, not a mistake or inability, but something far more unsettling, an intelligence that consistently defied definition. Every answer she gave, every insight she revealed, create more questions than conclusions. And the more they tried to reduce her brilliance to a formula, a theory, or a pattern, the more it resisted simplification. Observers began to realize that the limits of their knowledge were not in the questions they asked, but in the assumptions they brought with them. They had expected to find gaps, to identify weaknesses, to classify ability within familiar boundaries. Instead, they found consistency in unpredictability, structure in intuition, and reasoning that followed patterns invisible to them. Their confidence faltered, replaced by uncertainty. They struggled to acknowledge, even privately, It was not just science that faltered. Society itself was challenged by her existence. Intelligence, according to prevailing thought, should conform to expectation, should appear in predictable contexts, should be measurable and understandable. She did not follow those rules, and in defying them, she exposed the fragility of assumptions, the limitations of human understanding, and the danger of defining potential too narrowly. Every observation session became a mirror reflecting not only her abilities, but their own shortcomings. Every answer she gave, clear and unambiguous to her, became a source of doubt for the observers. The more they attempted to quantify and explain, the more obvious it became that the tools at their disposal were insufficient. Measurement revealed only part of the picture. Intuition, creativity, and perception remained beyond their reach. She, meanwhile, remained largely unaffected by their confusion. She did not perform for their understanding, nor attempt to meet expectations beyond what felt natural to her. Her intelligence was quiet, authentic, and human, and that authenticity made it all the more challenging for them to categorize. When pushed for explanations of her thought processes, she could articulate pieces, but the whole often remained elusive even to herself, because it was experiential, intuitive, and deeply embedded in a way of perceiving the world they had not considered. Some observers reacted with frustration, others with awe. A few began to question the very principles of their methodology. Could human brilliance truly be constrained by rigid measurement? Was intelligence more complex, more subtle than they had believed? These questions, whispered in private, reflected an evolving understanding that the universe of the human mind could never be fully mapped by numbers or theory alone. Outside the laboratories and study rooms, the consequences of the unexplainable spilled into her life. Attention became scrutiny. Everyday moments carried unspoken pressure. She could feel the difference in the way adults spoke around her, the cautiousness in their tone, the weight of expectation attached to every answer. Success was no longer sufficient. Only an ongoing demonstration of capability seemed to satisfy observers. And yet, no amount of performance could fully explain her, because her brilliance was not performative. It was inherent, living, and quietly unstoppable. This tension, the gap between what was observed and what could be explained, created a unique environment. It was part fascination, part anxiety, part awe. Each observer had to reconcile their own understanding of the world with the undeniable truth before them, that a human mind could operate beyond the frame orcs they had built to understand it. They faced the limits of certainty, and with that recognition came both humility and discomfort. It was in these moments of confrontation with the inexplicable that the story gained its deepest resonance. Her existence demonstrated that human potential cannot always be captured in formulas or theories. It reminded those around her, and those who would later learn of her story, that brilliance is not always legible, measurable, or predictable. Some of the greatest minds, perhaps even entire generations of thought, are illuminated not by what can be explained, but by what defies explanation. In recognizing that they could not fully explain her, the observers were forced to confront their own limitations. The emphasis shifted from proving competence to acknowledging complexity. They could describe what she did, but not fully why. They could record results, but the essence of her thinking remained beyond their comprehension. And that inability to explain became the most profound truth of all. Intelligence is not merely a set of outcomes. It is a living process, a convergence of perception, experience, and intuition that cannot always be captured on paper or in theory. Her story, therefore, was not only a narrative of exceptional ability, it was a lesson in humility, a reminder that the universe of the human mind is vast and intricate, often defying the frameworks imposed by tradition, science, or societal expectation. And while they may have catalogued her responses, measured her results, and speculated endlessly, what remained unquantifiable was the essence of her insight, the human spark that no method, no matter how rigorous, could fully contain. This unexplainable intelligence left a legacy that stretched beyond the immediate observers. It challenged assumptions, inspired contemplation, and created a quiet tension between what was known and what could be imagined. It was a reminder that sometimes the most significant discoveries are not those we can define, but those that expand the boundaries of our understanding, those that force us to confront the reality that the human mind, in all its complexity, cannot always be fully explained. And so, the inability to explain her became not a failure of observation, but a triumph of revelation, a truth that human potential is larger, stranger, and more extraordinary than even the most confident observers can predict. The story of what they could not explain remains a testament to curiosity, perseverance, and the enduring mystery of brilliance itself. Amidst the attention, tests, and unanswered questions, the human side of her story began to emerge, the part that no observation, measurement, or scientific note could ever capture. Intelligence alone could not define her experience. Beyond the remarkable answers, beyond the intuitive brilliance, lay emotions, pressures, and a quiet awareness of being different in a world that did not fully understand her. And it was in this human dimension that the story became profoundly relatable, deeply emotional, and unmistakably real. The constant scrutiny shaped her interactions in ways subtle but significant. Everyday moments, a conversation with a friend, a quiet walk, a fleeting gesture of play, were shadowed by the knowledge that someone might be observing, evaluating, or measuring. Childhood, which should have been, and full of ease, exploration, and ordinary wonder, was complicated by the weight of expectation. She felt the difference in how people spoke to her, the cautiousness in their tone, the subtle pauses before praise or questions. The very air seemed charged with anticipation. Yet within this, her resilience became evident. She did not shrink from the world. She engaged with it in ways authentic to herself. Curiosity remained her guide, not the expectations of others. She asked questions, observed quietly, and responded with the honesty of someone discovering life moment by moment. Intelligence was only one layer of her experience. Beneath it lay vulnerability, sensitivity, and an understanding of her own humanity. Those observing her could record results, note behaviors, and speculate endlessly, but they could never fully measure the emotional landscape she navigated. Moments of fatigue, moments of doubt, moments of quiet joy or sorrow, these were invisible to scientific tools, yet they profoundly shaped who she was and how she engaged with the world. She felt the weight of attention and expectation acutely, even if she rarely expressed it outwardly. In private moments, she processed experiences that adults could not see. She reflected on interactions that felt complicated, tried to understand the intentions behind praise, and reconciled the pressure to perform with her desire simply to be herself. These moments of introspection were not only natural, but necessary, a quiet grounding that allowed her to retain her authenticity despite the external demands placed upon her. The human aspect of her story also revealed the subtle isolation that often accompanies exceptional ability. While admired, she was also set apart. Relationships with peers became challenging, as the very brilliance that attracted attention simultaneously created distance. Adults, fascinated and sometimes fearful of her intellect, often failed to connect emotionally, inadvertently reinforcing her solitude. The brilliance that set her apart became both a gift and a burden. Despite this, she remained deeply connected to the world through observation and empathy. Her intelligence was not detached or clinical. It was infused with understanding, insight, and recognition of the humanity in others. She noticed emotions, subtle reactions, and the ways in which ordinary life carried complexity. Her mind was exceptional, but it was always grounded in a human perspective, a lens of connection and awareness that transcended mere measurement. Even within the scientific observation, moments arose that revealed this dimension. When asked questions designed to test logic, she sometimes responded with humor, subtle commentary, or unexpected insight that reflected emotional intelligence as much as intellectual ability. Observers, caught off guard, often struggled to classify these moments. Were they evidence of reasoning, creativity, or something else entirely? In truth, they were all of these and more, expressions of a mind alive not only to questions, but to the lived experience of thought and feeling. This human side of her story also illuminated the pressures imposed by expectation. Each answer carried weight. Each demonstration of brilliance attracted attention, and the implicit demand to continue performing created a constant undercurrent of tension. Yet she endured. She did not collapse. Under scrutiny. She did not retreat into conformity. Instead, she integrated her intelligence with self-awareness, navigating the world with a quiet dignity that few fully recognized. It is within this human complexity that her story gains its emotional power. It reminds us that intelligence alone does not define a person. True brilliance is inseparable from the lived experience, from emotional resilience, from the subtle negotiation between self, society, and circumstance. Her journey was one of navigation, of curiosity, observation, and survival, within the weight of attention and expectation. And it is this journey that makes her story timeless, relatable, and profoundly moving. In the end, the human side of her story underscores a simple truth: extraordinary ability is inseparable from humanity. It is lived, felt, and experienced. It carries joy and burden, insight and isolation, brilliance and vulnerability. And it is this dimension, invisible to measurement, unrecorded in notes, and unquantifiable by even the most meticulous observer, that makes her story enduring. It is not simply a story of intelligence. It is a story of being human in a world unprepared for the extraordinary. A story of quiet strength and authentic resilience that continues to inspire long after the observers have left. Her experience reminds us that human potential is never solely an equation, a set of results, or a sequence of measurable outcomes. It is lived through emotions, shaped by attention, informed by resilience, and revealed in the quiet moments of life that science can observe but never fully grasp. And it is this intersection of intellect and humanity that transforms a remarkable story into a timeless narrative of understanding, empathy, and awe.